All right, perfect timing. You like perfect timing? Sometimes it works. Like when you want to say something to somebody and they come, like happened at work with a couple other people. I was just kind of watching from afar, but one was mad at the other one for not doing something, and the other one just came up and said, you know what, I should have done it. It's perfect timing. That worked out well, but suppose you're waiting for traffic to clear and everybody's running at the same speed both ways. We don't like perfect timing that way, do we? No. Paul, though, in Galatians chapter 4, claims that Jesus came at the perfect time. And when if you like history, I remember Barry when he was preaching not too long ago, not too many people like to study history. I almost raised my hand and said, I do. I like to know where things came from. I study etymology, which is where words, what they meant when they were starting and how they have evolved into different meanings today. Like cool wasn't necessarily about the temperature anymore, is it? And other words have gone the other way. But I like history. I like to know where it came from. It makes sense then where we have our things here. And Paul said, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son. And so I remember in high school, my teacher in high school, Mr. Orris was his name, he turned me on to history. I didn't like it before then. None of my friends really caught on to it either. But he said, study of history is important because if you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat the mistakes. And when I got to college, I was studying Hebrew especially. And this word for remember, do this to remember me, isn't just a thinking back. We're not supposed to eat bread, drink the cup, thinking of a dead man hanging on a cross. You're to put yourself in the story. So it does require some set of history, but that was his philosophy of history. Put yourself in the story. How would you have reacted? How would you have thought? Would you have done it the way it was done? If not, what would you have, and it really brought it alive for me. And then when I understood what the Hebrew word meant, would I have been at the foot of the cross? Would I have run away in the garden when he was arrested? Would I have betrayed him or denied him? It's important to understand that. So thinking back on history is very important. And when it talks about Jesus coming at the perfect time, I never really appreciated a study more than when you study the life of Christ and realize it was before he was even born, he was acting in the world. Paul said the rock that followed them through the wilderness during the Exodus, that was Christ. Yeah, they did mention a lot of other times. Before Abraham was, I am, Jesus said. So that wasn't the beginning of his existence. And that throws a wrench into some works when you get the English translation that he was the only begotten of God, because to beget originally meant to give birth to give a start. And actually what John was saying, he was the one and only, the unique. He was the only one in all of history, before, during, and after, who was both human and God within that body. So that's important to understand where these things come from. And when you talk about him coming at the perfect time, I appreciate and have enjoyed studying that history. I enjoy the study every time I look at it. And it took place in the time period we call the intertestamental time period, the time between the testaments. We Americans, we love to analyze everything and write it down and map it out, and then we think we've got a handle on it. We know what we're doing. Well, I'm that way. I like it. It sets a pattern. It does show a plan being acted out. And God was, that time period between, and it's, okay, as it says here on the handout I gave to you here, the Bible offers no information between Malachi and John the Baptist's ministry. The Bible doesn't give us any information, but people at the time period, through those 400 years, they did write quite a few histories and give us some look at what was going on. So you got to wonder if God did kind of put it into the people to write something about that and keep a record of what was going on. Language and writing was a new technology. Moses was able to write, and that is who most theologians believe wrote the 5 books of Moses, the first ones to record it, put it in writing. Now, writings were there before. I remember going to a museum and seeing one of the oldest, what you might say, documents of what would be a written language. And they dated it almost to the time of Noah. But what it was an accounting of someone's cattle and sheep, the count of them. So it was numbers as well as the name for each of the animals. That was interesting to see. But it was a new technology. Most people could not do it. They did not have the higher education to read and write. So God had to put people in place who did. Moses was trained in Pharaoh's court. Now, he was not, as the movie depicts, going to be the next Pharaoh. That was always blood related. And that dynasty would not have allowed. And he grew up knowing who he was. He grew up knowing he was Hebrew. His mother weaned him. She was paid to take care of the baby. Miriam kind of worked that out. So he grew up knowing who he was. But he was learned, and they were trained. They would take people of high skill or intelligence, train them to be the taskmasters, to be the workers, in charge of the workers, because then the people were more liable to work for someone who was their own, who felt like an ally. But then one day his anger got the best of him. Yeah. But Moses was trained. Joseph was trained. Took care of his brothers. They didn't like it, did they? No. A lot of that time period. And in the New Testament time period, writing became more useful, but it was very expensive. You either bought the papyrus, is where we get our word paper from. They were reeds that grew along riverbanks, and they would slice them real thin and then weave them and then polish them. They don't last long, do they? After you cut them down, they don't last. So they would use animal skins, and they would use an ink, and it would draw on top of the animal skin. But it was a smooth surface, so if you made a mistake, you could wipe it right out, blot it out. That's not going to last too long either, is it? So you're going to need copyists. And this is what Scripture does for us, is they actually put it into this format of writing. But between Malachi, the last of the Old Testament prophets, there was what the Jews called no voice of God. No one claimed to have a vision. No one claimed to write down what God told them. Like John said, he was told to write down everything he saw and everything he heard. Even Paul talks about the Spirit moving him to write certain things. But between Malachi, and it was actually between Malachi and between John the Baptist, no one claimed a vision. But when John's father went into the temple to do his duty as priest, Took a little longer than it should have. Everybody's outside wondering, what's taking so long? Because if anybody went into the inner sanctuary, which only the Levites or the sons of Aaron could go into, not even the Levites could go in there, on pain of death. If something happened, how do you get the dead body out of there? It's desecrating the inner sanctuary. So sometimes they would tie a rope around the guy's ankle before he went in. In case something happened, they'd pull him out. There are histories about that. It's nice little tidbits that give you some clues that people were thinking. But they call this the 400 years of silence. So 400 just roundabout, not an exact number of years. No one knows when Malachi definitely started writing or published his writing to the people. They call them 400 years of silence, but God was anything but silent. He was very, very busy. But when Zechariah got that message and everybody around it, once the baby was born, they were going to name him after his father. His mother said, the angel told me. 400 plus years, no one had ever heard any statement like that. Not from a respectable figure as a priest's wife. And when his father couldn't speak, and then was able to afterwards say, no, his name is John. Everyone took note and wondered what this kid was going to be. So for 400 years, silence was broken. God has now spoken through somebody. So a lot of people think the intertestamental period was the time between Malachi and Jesus' birth. Well, that was to come just 6 months later, but actually what broke the silence was John the Baptist. But God was very busy during that time period, during those 400 years. And I like to see how things were put in place. Now, silence in Hebrew symbology usually denoted when work was finished. Remember when Jesus was on the cross and he yelled out, "It is finished!" Silence. He was in the tomb for 3 days, 3 nights. Quiet. Finished. Next morning, the women started speaking, so the silence was over, wasn't it? But that just showed a finality. In the book of Revelation, when something happens and all this stuff, and then there was a period of silence. Okay, done. Jesus went to heaven and ascended and sat down. His work's done. So this 400 years, that's when then the Masoretes, who were the Jews who would make the copies, update the copies because the old originals are wearing out, fading away. That was the last anybody had ever heard. So they closed their canon at Malachi. But there were a lot of things written between there. And some religious organizations do claim these books as authoritative. They call them, though, the second canon. And that Latin term is deuterocanon. Deutero meaning second. Canon was a measuring stick. It wasn't a big military gun. But the military guns looked like that, and that's what they called them that. But these books had to measure up to a certain standard to be considered authoritative and inspired by a holy God. And so they were studied and looked back through their history. The people that wrote them, were they authoritative? Were they... and made sure that nothing contradicted what was already established as known about God. So these things had to measure up. Well, Jerome, writing in the 4th century, actually not writing, but translating in the 4th century, when Rome wanted to legalize Christianity. And Constantine wanted to do that because Christians actually had a great relationship. What the Romans feared the most in their conquered territories was rioting and insurrection. They put those down right away. Jesus actually took the place of an insurrectionist. Barabbas, you remember. They They would shoot first and ask questions later, in our terminology today. But Jerome then was assigned to translate the scriptures that the Christians were claiming were fulfilled and make that their sacred text. Well, when the Romans were combining these, putting them all together, Jerome evidently was in charge of that. Anything not accepted by the Jewish hierarchy with good reason was set aside. They were like this right here, just not included. They're still there. It's good history. It's just not what we are going to establish as our policy for our state religion. And the state is just the government-run religion. And usually it was the same, the Roman government as it is today. If you want somebody to really mess something up, let the government be in charge. Because the people that Constantine hired in his cabinet to take care of the religion, instead of being the pagans and the Jews were going to riot every time the Romans went into a certain area because of their paganism, they took over Christianity, which was thought to have been a sect of Judaism. But these people actually loved each other. They took care of each other. They brought about peaceful lifestyles. And so it was useful. But the people who were hired by Constantine to be part of these councils to decide doctrine, the Christian leaders didn't want any part of that because they knew where the government of Rome was going with it. So it was a political appointment. These were not necessarily Christian people who were putting together the doctrine. So Jerome, if it was anything antagonistic to their philosophy of government, set aside.
How long did it take?
It took, well, let's see. I'd have to go back and really look at my notes there. Jerome was in the 4th century, so that was the 300s. It was established, thought to be firmly established, the 27 New Testament books in 340 AD. So it appears that those councils and everything took place during some 40 years when they were arguing about which ones should be included and which ones should not. Those that had a major majority were included. Those that even had a small amount of discontent were set aside because, after all, hey, you know what? If they're not very long, they don't really say much. Yeah, just put them aside. And that word is a combination word of apo and kryptein. We say apocrypha. Set aside, not included. We get our word crypt from that Greek word. You know what a crypt is? Hidden. That's what it means, literally, and that's what you do with a dead body. You put it in a coffin, close it up, bury it in the ground. You hide it. Yeah, so set aside. Now, the Roman Church did use those, a lot of those that once the Christians established their own canon and agreed to the 27 that we have, those were not included. Now, it's all over YouTube now. It's a big viral thing now for the Ethiopian scriptures because they think the Ethiopian eunuch took what he knew after being baptized by Philip and leaving Jerusalem after the Passover season was over with Pentecost and on his way home. And Ethiopia was in Africa, and it was kind of hidden from the Roman government and their oversight. So they were pretty much free to do whatever they wanted to. And they have a bunch more books in their scriptures. You really do need to do your own homework on those and read those. It's good history, and they do have some truth to them. But, I think God is merciful and kind and not wanting to zap us over the head if we don't know everything and know it right. If this is the best we can do with what we've got, God's with us. He continues to bring us along. So those books, the Deuterocanonical books, were hidden. But they have good history, and what they show us are 5 important things in history that came about between the writing of Malachi and the birth of John the Baptist that were so necessary, foundational for a religious movement to start and gain momentum and spread throughout the world. First of all, do you know why God wanted his people in what is known as the Mediterranean, which means literally the middle of the earth? And you have to think about the spread of Christianity from there. Start in one spot, spread out. So you don't start on one of the ends. He called it the land of milk and honey, not because it was fertile for farming, but because it was the central focal point of all of the trade routes going anywhere throughout the world to other areas. They had to pass through one central point, and that's where he wanted his people, so that everybody coming through would be influenced. And so that's why he wanted Abraham where he was. That's why during the Exodus then he led the people back to that area. That's why he established them there. But they forgot about him, didn't they? Usually when things are going good, who gets the credit? Yeah, we do. And so God had to put them in time out. And that was the first of the important developments to come about. A group of people that were hated when a certain segment of the Jews returned from Babylon to reestablish and rebuild Jerusalem. There were people that were transplanted there from other conquered areas by the Assyrians and then taken over by the Babylonians. And when the Jewish people, mostly from the tribe of Judah, after the destruction of the temple, they could not. That's where all the records were kept, and those were all burned. And so no one could really trace their lineage back. They could have their own family trees just by memory, and they re-recorded what they could. But a lot of the people coming back, the majority were of the tribe of Judah. There were mostly, though, Levites. The priests came back and reestablished after the building of the temple. But there were a group of people there who had been brought in by the Assyrians and the Babylonians to populate the area. And they were used as human shields against any invaders. They were set out there in certain areas. And if an enemy came to attack, they were the first ones to get hit. Then the Assyrians and the Babylonians would get their people together and go over there and squelch it. None of their people got hurt. That's how nice they were to the conquered people. But those people who were resettled there, not all of the Jews in Judea and what we call Palestine, not all of them were exiled. A lot of them stayed behind. And the actual exile for 70 years was a really good deal for them. They finally owned land and were able to farm their own food. But what they did is these other exiled peoples from other territories, and they're still around over there, and they're still fighting over there. They intermarried with the Israelites who were left behind. The Israelites married with them. So they mixed the race. They were not full-blooded Jewish. Unless you go back to Noah, where we're all related, and Adam. Well, and this happened to Solomon when he had so many wives and concubines. They wanted to practice their own, and they came to Judaism after the reestablishment of the temple just to have a religious presence. But they wanted to keep their old holidays and festivals, and they just gave them new names. So what they did is they mixed the religion as well. They call that syncretizing the religion. So when these people wanted to help rebuild, everything they looked like and acted like represented the very reason they got exiled to begin with. And they said, no, you have no part in this. And they kept them at bay. And in reaction then, they became antagonistic. Satan used them against the builders. You remember Nehemiah had to build the wall with a sword in one hand and trying to stack bricks in another. Yeah. And that animosity is still going on today. However, one good point. Jesus actually gave those people the time of day. Even a woman who was an outcast, for she wouldn't have been coming to the well to draw water in the middle of the day, alone. And the disciples came back and they found Jesus talking to not just a woman, a Samaritan woman. She went into town, the whole town came out, and great joy in that city. They were very open to the Christian message. And so they helped to spread Christianity. Because even after Pentecost, when after the stoning of Stephen, the people were spreading out, who did they go to and have success with first off? Not the Jews. Who were they? Samaritans. And they were everywhere. They came from all four corners of the earth at that time. So there were a lot of them who were present on the Passover that Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and ascended after visiting. So the Samaritans were an extremely important development, even though they were mixed, because what it did prove, and Paul writes this in Galatians, what it proves, it's not just one national race. Everybody is included. The next time period came in 331 BC. Alexander the Great defeated the Persians. Now, the Persians were the original settlers in what is now Iran and Iraq. Those people are Persian. If you want to consider them a race of any kind, consider them Samaritans. Many of them are Christians. The government was a militant government that took over by political force and used terror to keep power. And any Christians over there now had to meet in hiding. So they were subjected to a non-Christian government. So they were Persians in ancestry. But Alexander the Great, his purpose was to influence and educate the whole world on the Greek philosophy of life and the Greek culture. And he did it at a very young age. I hear he was only like 32, 33 years old. Died in a drunken stupor because his main four generals were getting complaints from the officers who were tired of bivouac and traveling and wanted to go home and quit fighting. Yeah, that time period was very important to the spread of Christianity. He died in 323 BC. And the empire then was divided between his four generals. Two of them, Ptolemy and Seleucid. Ptolemy was in the Middle East. Seleucid was in North Africa. Or do I have it backwards? I think Ptolemy. Ptolemy was very acceptable of the Jews and their religion at the time. Seleucid, being in Africa, was power hungry. And they would fight each other. And of course, right in the middle are the Jewish people. Right in the middle. The Seleucids took over, and one in particular named Antiochus. claimed himself as being the Great One, Epiphanes. The Jews called him Epimanes, which was a play on the word, but you know what it means? You remember? Pig. A hog. And that was because he was going to be the supreme leader. And so, you know our concept here, 3 strikes and you're out. Strike 1, he went into the temple. He offered the sacrifice on the altar. What animal did he use? The one he was used to using for his gods, and it was a pig. So he was known as Antiochus the pig by the Jews. Of course, they kept it under wraps. They didn't say that publicly. But Antiochus caused a revolt. A guy named Judas, son of Hasmon, nicknamed the Hammer. That's what the word Maccabeus means. He led a revolt like Barabbas was trying to do at the time of Jesus and drove off that Greek occupation, known then as the Hasmonean or the Maccabean period. So for about 100 years, they rededicated and purified the temple, and the Hebrew word for dedication is Chanuk. You ever hear of Hanukkah? Yeah. It was done during the winter solstice when the Greeks weren't paying attention. They were living it up in festivals for the end of the year. And that's when Judas the Hammer attacked. And the Jews enjoyed a brief period of independence from peace, but soon they started fighting amongst themselves. But the Greek influence cannot be over or underestimated. Alexander determined to spread the Hellenistic culture everywhere, and we still practice a multitude of their philosophies and what you call habits. We still have a long list of them. He established schools for everybody because knowledge was power. The other governments, and then the Romans came in later, and they shut down the schools. If the people know what's going on, they're going to rise up against us. But Alexander wanted them to know what was going on. And a lot of ways of teaching for people who couldn't read and write. You had art. I love the cathedrals in New York City. I'd go in just to look around inside. The stained glass windows were actually Bible stories and artwork. And their philosophy, how to live an efficient life. But the main thing they brought to the spread of Christianity was a common language throughout the whole world. And all of the New Testament letters that we have, and those who are also set aside, were written in Greek. Everybody. So if you could go to one territory, Paul and his crew could go into one city and stand up and preach, and people could listen and understand, because probably speaking Greek. They even had a translation into Greek called the Septuagint. 70 scholars were used, and that took a decade or more to translate the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures into Greek. And that was the Bible of Jesus' day, the Bible that he and the apostles quoted from. And it was called the LXX because that's Roman numerals for 70. L being 50, and then an X is a 10. So you got 2 10s. The Roman period began then, and these people were vicious. They were cruel to anybody who was non-Roman. Or they were expendable if they didn't have a talent they could use. They massacred countless Jews for 2 reasons. They refused to work on one day of the week. They sat down and they didn't fight back either, so the Romans, it's like shooting fish in a bucket. They just went through and massacred them. The blood ran thick. Their drainage systems were red with blood, the histories say. They also refused to acknowledge and worship the emperor as a god. But they were so stubborn and hard-headed, they would not change, and the Romans got tired of both the killing, the mess of the blood, and the stench. And so they finally allowed them, if you know what, if you could just do your own thing, do your own worship, take care of your own people and keep them in subjection, okay, we'll let you. And that then is where the Sanhedrin came from. They were the Supreme Court for the Jewish people. And they're still in effect today, and the Jews still fear them today. When I was delivering for FedEx over in Canton, Ohio, I delivered to a very Jewish neighborhood. The Jacobs brothers, who built the stadium for the Cleveland Browns, were one of my customers. I could not go past the front porch when I delivered a package or a letter. A certain number of steps. They'd come out and stop me. I even delivered to the synagogue. But I do remember a jeweler in town who was cheating the people, and the government was on to him. He didn't care. Could care less about the American government. Someone in the government talked to the head of the local Sanhedrin, and he came begging for forgiveness on his knees and changed everything. I mean, the local Sanhedrin really has power today. That's why Jesus was taken to the Jewish leaders, because they couldn't kill anybody without Roman permission, and only a member of the Sanhedrin could go.
Simon the Zealot, were these people active in resisting the Jews? I mean...
Oh, no, they were...
I mean, that's Jewish leaders. I mean, in the Roman...
Yes.
Was they active
They were rogues. They were not willing to wait anymore for the coming kingdom. Just like everything else, God helps those who help themselves. Their philosophy was the same. If we're going to fulfill Scripture, we got to do it now. Jesus came as a peaceful protest. The Jews didn't want that. But one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. Can you imagine how he and Matthew might have gotten along, who was a tax collector? Well, what irked the Jews the most is that the Romans put the Herods in charge of Judea. I mean, the Herods were Idumeans. They were descendants of Esau. Jacob and Esau are still fighting today. Herod the Great built the temple to win the Jews' favor. The Jews said, "Thank you, now get out." The Romans allowed it to be built if they had a barracks for their soldiers right in the north side. So that they had their soldiers stationed where the hottest points in their territory would be possible revolt. They had a Jewish garrison, the fortress of Antonia, right there in the Jewish temple. The one wall that stands was one wall of that garrison. Yeah. And Paul was saved because that garrison was there. The Jews grabbed him and were going to pull him limb from limb, and it was the Romans who stepped in and saved him. A Roman high priest was inserted to ensure that there was no threat of revolt. They had a spy in the Sanhedrin. The Jews laughed because you know who the spy was at the time of Jesus? The real high priest was Annas. That's why they took Jesus to Annas first. But who was the high priest that the Romans recognized? Caiaphas. Do you know their relationship, though, between Annas and Caiaphas? Caiaphas was married to Annas' daughter. Bit of nepotism going on. Jews didn't care. As long as they behaved, whatever. All right. The Roman system cannot be over or underestimated either. They had a system of roads for moving their soldiers quickly that anybody could travel on, free of charge. They had safe travel through the empire. There were no borders to cross. Free trade. You want to board a ship, pay the cost. Paul and his companions go anywhere in the world, even as far as the Isles of Great Britain. The Romans governed them for over 500 years. They had an advanced government and court system that was to be fair to the person, and we still use that in our court system today. Engineering advancements. They brought aqueducts in so they could fertilize arid regions. And they allowed the Jews to build their own worship places called synagogue, which means to gather together. Interesting enough, the church translates the word ecclesia, which means to gather together. The church was based upon the synagogue, which was a place for the common man because the temple was not for anybody else. And also then, different groups within one religion could work together and temper each other. And you get a little bit off track, you got to be pulled back this way. And so it was kind of middle of the road. So you had Pharisees, the traditionalists. You had the Sadducees, who were the upper class rulers, kind of looked down on everybody else, but it was important to respect somebody. The Herodians, who did what they could to favor the government so they'd leave us alone. The Zealots, who really wanted to remind people that they're not in charge. We have someone coming. The Essenes, who went off into the wilderness and studied the scriptures and stored their scrolls when they knew the Romans were coming. Because they knew the first temple, when it was destroyed, they lost everything. And it took till 1945 till they found them. And they're still opening them. They're so brittle. And we're still finding new information. And because of Daniel's prophecies, he pinpointed the time of the coming of the Messiah to 33 AD. So it was the perfect time for the spread of Christianity. After Pentecost, the stoning of Stephen, the people were spread out and filled the whole earth. So these things, God was not quiet, was he? Those were not years of silence. God was very busy, and we benefit from all of that. He's still busy today, even though we may not hear him or get any more writing. And the idea of silence is, that's it. That's all you need to know. Go with it. God is going to judge you based on your attempt and desire to do it. And that's all learned from history. Let's not try to recreate our mistakes from the past. All right. We'll move on then from there because Satan's going to make sure to mess that up.